announced new airstrikes in eastern Syria. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made the announcement this morning during a presser in Seoul, South Korea.
Last night, our U.S. forces conducted precision strikes in eastern Syria against two facilities that are used by Iran's IRGC and affiliated groups. And I just want to remind you that these strikes are intended to disrupt and degrade the freedom of action and capabilities of these groups, which are directly responsible for attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria.
And here to talk about the rising tensions in the region and the U.S. response is Dakota Wood. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 2 decades and is now a senior research fellow for defense programs at the Heritage Foundation. Dakota, thanks for joining us and thank you for your service. First off, let's talk about these repeated attacks on U.S. bases. What's the objective here? I mean, what are they trying to achieve?
Well, there's always this signaling. It's a much overused word, but when a terrorist group attacks a U.S. base, oftentimes it's to buttress its own credentials. It's able to strike the great Satan, strike at the United States with really no negative consequence to them. So they show an ability to target U.S. forces, and that is their credentials. It's also a mechanism for Iran spur these groups, which would exist without Iranian support, to conduct these attacks against the United States as well. Perhaps in a strategic sense, they would want the United States to pull out of Syria, to pull out of Western Iraq, and kind of go back home. But this tit-for-tat response, attacks against the U.S., and then after many of these, we're talking almost 70 of these attacks against U.S. forces or installations just in the last 4 or 5 weeks, and then the United States responds with a 2-plane strike against a warehouse or 2. Clearly, this does not deter Iran or any of the groups in Syria that are conducting these sorts of attacks.
Yeah, and as we know, Secretary Austin announced U.S. strikes on 2 Iranian facilities in Syria last night, as we heard. I want to get your thoughts on the U.S. response.
Well, it's this messaging, right? So Washington, D.C., lives in this world where there's a narrative or a story to be told. There is messaging and signaling. It's all very nuanced. And the underlying thing is, if you, the bad guy, don't stop attacking us, then things might get worse. But behind that even is this reluctance to really go in aggressively. And there is a risk aversion. I mean, nobody wants to see the war expand, whether the Israeli-Hamas war or a larger conflict in the Middle East. It would be disastrous economically. And yet in that region, many of these groups only value strength, this muscularity of how they approach each other. And again, these little pinpoint sorts of precision strikes that do no serious harm to Iran or to its groups in that area doesn't deter them from anything. So risk aversion on the American side, very risk heavy and aggressive approaches in the Middle East. And I fear that this aversion from D.C. and fear of things getting worse might actually spur the larger war that a stronger response would actually prevent.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I mean, do you think if we took a more heavy-handed approach in the Middle East, do you think it could potentially provoke Iran more?
Well, I think the heavier-handed approach is really the only one that works. And, this is from a guy who spent almost 40 years associated with military things. I mean, war is just bad. As we're seeing, what occurs up there in Gaza, a lot of innocent people get harmed in the way. But this idea of weakness actually incentivizes the kind of behavior that you would want to prevent. So at times, the only answer is a very strong response, a multi-plane strike against terrorist training installations where it actually produces casualties, where groups in that area learn the lesson. If you try to attack the United States in any way, shape, or form, that there will be a heavy, heavy penalty to be paid. And that heavy penalty can't be diplomatic rhetoric, or the threat of additional sanctions. That has to be military force. And I think Washington, D.C. is missing that reality as it pertains to this part of the world.
Well, Dakota, thank you so much for weighing in. We really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure.